Yesterday's kind of letdown. So we have the pleasure to have here Dr. Renata Delia, who holds a PhD in games from the Institute of Digital Games, University of Malta. She currently works as an assistant professor of games at the School of Computer Science at the University of Lincoln in the UK. And her research focuses on love within the context of human-computer interaction, death and the macabre, I love it, and experimental game design, mostly about historical trauma. Outside academia, she's also worked as a games translator and a game writer. Today, she's going to talk about love and romance in games from a phenomenology perspective. And I love that she's going to talk about love on a Friday, doesn't it? Especially the topic, I found it very interesting. I can't wait to hear more about it. She's going to give her talk, obviously, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A session. The volunteers will be passing the microphone around, so if you have any particular questions for her, she will address them very happily. So thank you very much, Renata.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yeah, great. So yeah.
Let's just bring it a bit closer. Or maybe if we put it here.
Is this better? Great, thank you. So yeah, hello. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's the last day of the conference and it's quite early, so I'm sure you're all tired. I hope I won't tire you more. And thank you to Tigra for inviting me to be a keynote. I'm very, very excited and honored about this. As Irene very nicely introduced me, my name is Renata Delia. I'm a lecturer of games with the School of Computer Science, University of Lincoln. And I mostly research love within the context of human-computer interaction and other academic interests. But today, I'm specifically going to talk about love in games, and I'm going to ask the question of what is love, a question I'm sure we'll be able to answer within the hour. And this question is addressed, and what I'm going to present today is mostly inspired my PhD, which is about love in games as experience and representation. A bit of a disclaimer, my focus is predominantly romantic love, so this is what I'm going to mostly be talking about, and also most of my examples will be about romantic love, but my speech doesn't exclude other types of love. So to start with, I would like to show some ways that love can feature in games, and this, if we say list, is not exhaustive by any means, and there are many more ways or other fashions and facets that love can be included in games. So the first one is love as a game. So games that depict love as abstract, as a simulation or a metaphor even. We have Marriage by Rod Humble, a 2010 game, in which you control two squares and you have to negotiate space and needs within this framework. As an answer to that game, we have My Divorce by Brett Deville in 2010 again. And we also have other games like Will Love Tear Us Apart by Mighty Box in 2013. Again, a game that shows what happens once love leaves and how do you negotiate departure. And other games like Online Dating, 2014, which is a simple game about online dating, very hard, on which I may or may have not spent very many hours while doing my PhD for research purposes. So another category is love between NPCs, and here we're talking about narratives that don't include the player as a character at all. For example, Love Conquers All Games, published, which is a the company of Kristin Love, a designer predominantly interested and that has worked in games and love. Published Don't Take It Personally, Baby, Just in Your Story. It follows a high school teacher who manages to follow romantic relationships of his students, but the game doesn't involve his love story, or if it does, it's only a very small part. Gone Home, another game in which the main character uncovers a story and doesn't participate in the story, in the love story themselves. And To the Moon is another game where, again, the playable characters uncover a story that has already happened, has already taken place. And finally, not finally, another category is love between players. These are games where are multiplayer, usually online, and people come together, play the game, and maybe they'll form relationships, friendly relationships, or romantic relationships. World of Warcraft is a very prominent example. And it's interesting because players who have fallen in love in World of Warcraft have described the experience as something that happened because of the game. So it wasn't just a happenstance that two people came together in a social context. It's because of how people reacted as players that inspired love and affection between any two people or more. And Sibel is another game. It's not multiplayer online, but instead it portrays a relationship between two players that fell in love while playing an online game. So as we can see here, Sibel is an apt example that shows that all these different ways that love can feature in games, and it can be afforded in more ways than one. Sibel is not a multiplayer game, but it is a very good way to see how a multiplayer falling in love story between two players could have been experienced. And now, finally, we have love between player and NPC. It's probably the most common way love features in games. We have a very rudimentary love story that takes place in cutscenes, like in Tomb Raider, Angel of Darkness, between Lara and Curtis. We might have some interactivity. For example, in Heavy Rain, you can choose partially how the love story progresses. We can have games like Laser Street Larry, in which the love is also thematic, so it inspires the rationale of the game, and all the game actions involve around love and sex. And here, especially, we have a mini game which the player needs to successfully play, and as long as they do it successfully, Larry, who here is the nephew of original Larry, can continue talking to that girl. We have other games like Dragon Age, very popular romantic mechanics, in which you can choose through dialogue options to have romance. Dream Daddy, as an example of dating sims, a very prominent genre of love and relationships. And also games like Sims, they're not that many, but where love is part of the whole simulation and the whole simulated experience. And personally, and also epistemologically, I'm very interested in the question of, is there actually love in games? We've seen all these examples, but if love is abstract simulation between NPCs, or we have a love story between two human players falling in love, things are not as complicated. But what about games like the last category, where we have a human player falling in love with a computer-generated character. I think this is the context where most tensions rise, because we have an entity which is human and human being and has human needs as we understand them, and something beyond humanness, which might actually imply the question, can we love artificial humans? Is there a possibility to do that? And I want you to take a minute and consider yourselves, through your own media and game history, whether this is possible. I would like you to ask yourselves, have I ever loved a character? Have you ever felt an emotional attachment with a character? It's something that many people have discussed online. And here we have an account from a Reddit user who was answering to the question, who was your first crush? And the answer is, it was Cookie from Animal Crossing for GameCube. I used to bring her flowers and fossils and talk to her over and over until she told me to go away. Then one day she said she didn't want to lose me, and a heart emoticon floated above her head, and I knew it was real. So I sent her a love letter. Then a few weeks later, I had a friend over and we traveled to each other's towns. A few days later, I opened my mailbox and saw a letter from Cookie. She told me that she had moved. She moved to my friend's town. I was heartbroken and planted flowers where her house once stood. Then the next week at school, I walked into my class and everyone started laughing at me. Cookie had showed my friend the letter I wrote to her. She showed him the letter. I had never felt more betrayed in my entire life. I couldn't believe that she did that to me. So when I got home, I ripped up all the flowers I planted in her memory and vowed to never love again. I see past your fake smile, you cold-hearted bitch. It's obvious that for this person, Cookie is very much real. And it might look silly to us as adults, but it's important to take into consideration that especially for generations younger than me, so later than the early 90s, their first interaction and attachment to another being is very possible to happen within a game. So getting rejected by a digital character for a child could be very much real, and the feelings of heartbreak and rejection are also very much real. Also, I've been conducting this research, which is still running, so if you could participate, if you haven't already, I would very much appreciate it. And here's some very preliminary data. So as of now, I have around 293 answers, and as you can see, the predominant answer to the question if you've ever felt an emotional attachment to a character in a video game is yes. And this attachment is mostly described as friendly, with 109 answers, but romantic is not that far behind, with 92. And the next question, have you ever experienced romantic feelings, increases the percentage, because this question is only applied to people who answered not romantic in the previous question. So we have an increase in how many players have felt romantically towards a character. So it already shows that this is an important question that affects many people, and not only their play and gameplay, but their lives in general. So my question then becomes, how can we fall in love with fictional or artificial others? We know that we can have some feelings, but how is that possible in terms of both phenomenology and cognition and biology? We're human beings, biological beings. How can we fall in love with something that is not real? And my trail of thought goes to humans can and do love non-human beings, like their pets and plants, or even inanimate objects, like their cats and personal cars and personal collections. But does the player's attachment to a digital or fictional character work or function on the same principle? Because non-human beings are still part of our physical world, but what about beings that are not part of our physical world anymore? To answer to that question, I draw from the discipline of embodied perception and phenomenology. I've published a chapter about it if you want to read more on the topic. But basically what happens is that the space that engulfs our bodies, the space where we can act and see the results of our actions, is called peripersonal space. It's different to the abstract geometrical space of Cartesian and Euclidean coordinates. In that peripersonal space, our perception depends on our bodies. It's embodied. How our bodies react and act within this space and how they become subjects and objects of affects. So we perceive the space of digital games as our peripersonal space, even though it is not physical space anymore, because it can allow our actions, it can afford our enactment and intentional actions. Embodied perception is also equally responsible for our perceiving and understanding other agents within our peripersonal space as intentional beings. When we see someone performing an action, what happens is that a similar motor schema within our brains gets activated. So when we see someone performing an action, it's as if we are performing this action. And the next step is that we apply also intentions and we perceive these agents as volitional, because we have already made the connection that if it were ourselves performing this action, it would have been with a purpose. So the other agent performing in the same way as we do should also have intentions and volitions. So attaching oneself to a non-human has nothing to do with their ontology, but with our perception of them. It is all about how we perceive the others. We can't conceive their ontology. We can only understand how they are by relating them to ourselves. We recognize as embodied agents an agent that manipulates their bodies in a similar fashion as we do, no matter if this agent serves our ontology. And there is also an interspecies embodied perception, which means that if a being that is not a human being performs an action that is similar to our own performativity, we still perceive it as an intentional agent. Research has shown that when we see a dog or a monkey eat, our motor schemas are also activated and triggered because they perform an action that is very similar to how we perform. But if we see a dog bark or a monkey smack their lips, we don't have a similar activation, exactly because we don't have this motor schema ourselves. So the lack of physicality itself does not affect our perception by default. Our brains, studies have shown, do not differentiate between materialities. When we play a video game, our brains transform figures on a flat screen to embodied characters. And this is true even when we perceive their emotions and not just their actions. Obviously, it's not automatic. The more anthropomorphic a character is, the better we perceive them as a human being. It is also a matter of consistency. If they consistently behave human-like, our perception of them as human-like remains very high. But as I said, this also happens with emotions and not just actions. When we see someone crying, we attribute specific feelings that this person might feel because we have associated feelings of, with this action when we cry. And here, for example, we have some faces. So what do you think the person on the top left is feeling? Any guesses? Skeptical. Close, close. Any other guesses? It could be. It could be, actually. It's contempt. Yeah. What do you think the top right? I think that's a bit easier. Yeah, he's smiling. He's happy. Bottom left. Yeah, disappointment, sadness. You feel sad. And bottom right. How would you feel if you saw this face? Very close. Angry, yeah, exactly. He's angry. So as you can see, there are some indications as to what the person is feeling by our perceiving them. And this goes into the theory of basic emotions by Paul Ekman and other theorists. And basically, we have a set of basic emotions that are considered universal, and they are we can identify them much more easily. Joy, surprise, contempt, sadness, disgust, anger, and fear are considered basic emotions. Do you notice anything in this picture? Exactly. Exactly, thank you. There is not a face for love. Love is not a basic emotion, and it does not equate to an ambiguous emotional response. So we already have difficulty making anthropomorphic agents in a different materiality. Love makes things even more complicated because it's not as basic as other emotions. Fear, for example, is very easy to simulate in games. Love is a high-level emotion. It's an experience even, and it's a conglomerate of many different aspects. So how do we design love? We saw that players can get attached to digital characters, but how can we consistently do that with intention and not just have it as a happenstance or a coincidence? How can we guarantee that this experience happens when we design a game? Experiencing love with a digital character is difficult for one additional reason, because it requires reciprocity. And I don't want to confuse this with reciprocation. Reciprocity means that an agent is capable of reciprocation. It doesn't mean that they have to reciprocate. Human beings do not always reciprocate each other's feelings, and that is fine. The fact that computer agents cannot choose to love makes all the tensions even greater. So love, and romantic love in particular, necessitates agents that they can choose to love us in a personal manner, that they become attuned to us as much as we become attuned to them. And this obviously, for now, is a very technological limitation. We have some AI models that try to simulate it, but they can either be user data-driven or literature-based, but they're still highly conclusive and inadequate. And also, developers are very hesitant to use NPCs with complex AI because they feel that the players won't like that some agency is removed from them and goes to other agents within the game. So this is a technological question and an anthropological, though. And until technology maybe gives us an answer, we're still stuck in this reality where games cannot afford the experience of genuine love, as in love with a character that can choose to love us. But what does that mean for games as we know them now, not in 10 years from now or in 5 years from now? Does the inability of games to foster the experience of genuine love mean that they cannot or do not afford love? If I don't fall in love with Mr. Darcy, Pride and Prejudice remains a love story. Does my inability to love Princess Peach dooms Mario to never be able to have his own happily ever after? Daniele Gatti, in Playing with Plants, Loving Computers, Queer Playfulness Beyond the Human, discusses how amorous playing with non-humans can be a way for us to question our subjectivity and human-centeredness. So games, even though they do not include agents that they can reciprocate, can be a space where we can ask, challenge our own human-centeredness and our own privilege to want to be loved, or loving only when we can be loved back. So attaching our desire to an object that cannot reciprocate is a valid way to transgress goal-oriented desire and experience love without the need to have it as an award. However, saying that non-reciprocatory love is not goal-oriented implies that reciprocatory love is goal-oriented. It's true that romantic love, as already discussed, must be reciprocatory. And this is an end state that relationships with non-humans are devoid of, exactly because it's human beings that can make this conscious choice. Yet it is not reciprocity in and of itself that makes romantic love goal-oriented, but the digitality we attribute to it. What I mean with that comes from affect theory, especially Tompkins' understanding of digitality and affect. Basically, we recognize reciprocation as a two-way situation. We either have love or we don't. We either have love that is reciprocated, so we have the ultimate satisfaction and an end state of guaranteed fulfillment, or we don't and we fall in despair and we are heartbroken. And this is a condition that happens culturally. We're conditioned to anticipate love as a win or lose scenario. It has happened historically. I don't have the time to go historically through this journey here, but I'm very happy to discuss it further if you're interested. But what is important to note is that love doesn't actually work like that. It might be represented as it does, but in our physical, primal being and living and experience, love is much more complicated, is analog rather than digital. It's a constant negotiation, it's a process of communicating desires. It's ambivalence rather than an end state. But instead, love in the popular and dominant paradigm is already infused with the promise of digitality as a savor to our existence. And since we're conditioned to perceive love already as digital, then digital games are the prime medium to offer this manipulated version of it, a love that is a quantifiable end state of reciprocation and satisfaction. This is the most crucial potential of games as critical texts, because it is when we cannot but experience love's constructed digitality that we recognize its limitations and the dissatisfaction that it entails. So love as an experience and love as representation are two distinct, albeit connected, phenomena. So games may not be able to afford love as of now, because it demands agents of reciprocity, as already discussed, but they can and do afford love as a representation, either as an abstract simulation, we saw some examples in the beginning, and or as a constructed, manageable fantasy, which I call romance. And here we have some examples. Thane from BioWare's Mass Effect 2. We have Kaidan from Mass Effect 1 and 3. Here it's from 1. Fenris from Dragon Age 2, who's my favorite NPC, romanceable NPC. The Witcher 3 is another game where we have a romantic plot with specific results, and even though there is some choice, the plot is very constructed, is very scripted. You don't have much freedom in other than actualizing it. And Skyrim as well is another game. And as we can see in all those examples, games can and do afford a coded romantic experience that follows a very scripted narrative of fulfillment and satisfaction. You either get the NPC and have all the boons or not. But as players, we understand that this is a very short-lived satisfaction. Once you finish the romantic narrative, there is nothing more to do with this NPC, both narrative and gameplay-wise. The ability of interaction gets diminished or completely devoid. There's no progression. There are no more mechanics to simulate the progress of the relationship. Once the romance is locked, it becomes more or less unplayable. Much like once Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth get together, the book ends. Yet in games, we get to experience this short-livedness and understand all the dissatisfaction that it entails. We are there after the end of the book to continue living this romance that now doesn't have any fulfillment anymore. And obviously in other games, it's even more pronounced. For example, in the so-called damsel in distress narrative, where you just have to reach the end of the game to get love as a reward, and then nothing happens. Still, we see even in games when there is some sort of choice, like Catherine, there's a very quantifiable end. You either comply with the code and get the happy ending, or you fail to do so and die. There's no in-between. There's nothing in between in terms of desire, love, or intimacy. Even in games where they have a more transgressive representation of love, like Kartoffel Boyfriend, where you can date birds, or Perfect Date, where you can date cats, the plot is still quite normalized. You choose a character, you romance them, and then the end. And of course, one cannot bypass all the problematic elements of representation in games, for example, the over-sexualization of female companions, and many other aspects that many theorists have already identified and discussed, also in this conference. So we have also an element of representation that needs to be worked on. However, games possess the ability to inspire critical discussions that challenge the hegemonic need of this rigid desire. They can afford it, and it's fine. It's fine if we want this experience, but they can also take us a step further. For example, in Stardew Valley, it has a very basic romantic plot. You can marry NPCs, for example, Abigail. And what happens is once you marry them, their script, it's like it runs out. They stop doing almost anything of consequence. Fans of the game have addressed that by modding the game, which retriggers their pre-marriage code. But theorists have interpreted that if the NPCs stop behaving in a certain way after they get married, it means that maybe they have become depressed. And if you mod the game, you remove their ability to be sad while being married with you. So is it laziness from developers' side, or is it a commentary of the player's privilege and how they anticipate to be the only true agent of the game, and the game only caters to their needs? It opens up discussions. Also, other games like Boyfriend Dungeon include characters where they can be romanced, but not reach a fulfilling end or forever happily ever after. For example, Thunder, spoiler alert, rejects the player and allows for a romantic experience without this guaranteed end. You can have a romantic experience, treasure it for what it is, but without the guarantee of a satisfactory ending. There are also games like Doki Doki Literature Club, which take an ironic stance to player expectations and what they think a game should be, and how NPCs should just be bodies that the player can consume. And finally, we also have meta games like Loved. It's a game by Alexander Assayas, a very good game. I totally recommend it, which talks about how games can give romance as a promise to the player for having complied with the code, while in the end, the reward is just a single coin, showing the futility and fictionality of this promise, which is obviously hegemonically and heteronormative and patriarchal. And this also fits into how games have, from the start, been also theorized as romantic enactments, and this goes back to Huizinga, and again is a very big topic that we can discuss further if you'd like. So, towards a conclusion, if there can be a conclusion on this subject, which is, at least for me, an ending, while in literature, cinema, and other media, the participation of the receiver is fictional and or imagined, in games the participation is very much real and somatic. In this, we can viscerally understand the difference between experiencing love and experiencing romance. And this quality of games may facilitate our accepting love's ambivalence, while retaining the pleasure and limited satisfaction that romance can offer, without, however, confusing the two. The absurdity of love's fictionality is more pronounced in games because they constitute condensed and designed lived experiences. But it is not that their digitality corrupts love. It's not that the games cannot afford love. It is rather that games show how prone love is to codification and how constructed and fabricated romantic love is as an experience. Again, it's fine as long as we're made aware of the differences between the two. Here's an excerpt from The Magicians by Liv Grossman, which I think completely shows what I'm discussing here. I'll quote, "But the most important point," Penny said, "is that at the end of the wandering dune, Helen hit all the buttons somewhere in her aunt's house in Cornwall. She felt they were too mechanical. They made the journey too easy. Their power was wrong. You shouldn't be able to just go to Fillory whenever you wanted, like catching a bus," she argued. "A trip to Fillory had to be earned. That had always been the way. It was a reward for the worthy, bestowed by the rum gods Amber and Amber. The buttons were a perversion of this divine grace, a usurping of it. They broke the rules. Amber and Amber couldn't control them. Fillory was fundamentally a religious fantasy, but the buttons weren't religious at all. They were magical. They were just tools with no values attached. You couldn't use them for anything you wanted, good or evil. They were so magical, they were practically technological. Love, or rather games, are then the technological buttons to love's religious quality. But this quality is constructed, is not inherent. So games are a means to showcase this fantasy, to show how what we attribute to love as this, or we have been conditioned to attribute to love as this all-fulfilling, satisfactory experience that constitutes the pinnacle of our existence, is but a fiction, a fantasy, something we've learned, but not something that actually is the case. So in the end, games do facilitate the experience of love, more so outside games rather than in games. They allow us to see the confines of a romantic fantasy that portrays love as all this all-fulfilling end state, which in turn enables us to reject it and embrace love's ambivalence and all excitement this entails. And if not reject it, because we can still love a good romance, contextualize it and give it the notice and the importance that it has, but always in conjunction, relation, and comparison to genuine love. So, as an end note, I'll say that we might not be able to love artificial humans yet, but games can show us what it means to love as a human. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Renata. That was really interesting. I'm sure we all enjoyed it very much. We're now going to open a Q&A session if anyone has any question to ask.
Can hear you.
Thank you for the great talk. There's so much echo. I was a bit confused about the categorization in the beginning. So, you said love between player and NPCs? Can you hear me still? Okay. So, you were talking about the players versus NPCs and the love between them, but according to what you explained later, wouldn't it be player character and NPCs now? Or do we need different categories between player and NPCs now, and player character and NPCs? Because I was thinking, I'm sure many of us share the experience of playing a game where your player character, the character you are embodying, has to be entangled in some kind of romantic relationship, but you don't feel anything for that character. So I don't think we always have to share the experience. So I was a bit confused because players, like in your Animal Crossing example, can feel love for an NPC you don't have anything to do in the game with. So it can be a character that your player character is not really romantically entangled with, but you still feel some feelings for it. But yeah, I was just
Thank you.
wondered like if you need like different categories there or.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I would like to address that. Sorry. I've been talking for non-stop. I would like to address that by saying that for me, the difference is not there in the category, is in the feelings. The category remains player or playable character and NPC because I attribute a dynamic relationship with between player and playable character. Daniel Vella has talked expressively, and I